think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
In this episode, I'm going to continue recounting various stories from my past. And I also planned on reading multiple stories this time, but one of them wound up being much longer than I expected. So it will only be the one story I read on this episode. And I call it Living with a Zombie. But first, time for the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
Now some strange occurrences from Manitoba, Canada. There are some lake monster reports from Cedar Lake, Dolphin Lake, Dirty Water Lake, Lake Manitoba, Red River, Lake St. Martin, Lake Winnipeg, and Lake Winnipegosis. In the Easterville area, numerous sightings of Bigfoot-type creatures, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1973. Other places in Manitoba where Bigfoot were seen pre-1981 include near Reynolds, summer 1970, near Pointe du Bois, July 1974, New Beauséjour, June 1975, near Long Plains Reserve, July 1975, Agassiz Provincial Forest, October 1975, Poplar River, 1976, near Steinbach, July 10, 1979, Little Saskatchewan Indian Reserve, October 1979. Near Falcon Lake, Steve Michalak, prospecting for minerals in the woods, saw two UFOs, one of which landed. After 30 minutes of changing color, a door opened and a purple light shone out. Witness could hear voices and shouted in 6 languages with no response. He went nearer, put his head in the opening, and saw a maze of flashing lights. He examined the craft exterior and saw no seams or rivets. He touched the machine, and his rubber glove melted and his shirt caught fire. The UFO took off, and Michalak went to seek medical help, May 20th, 1967. Lone Island, Whiteshell Provincial Park. 2 policemen fishing in Whiteshell River saw 8-foot Bigfoot on shore. Next morning, they were woken by dogs barking at 5:30 a.m., and from their camper saw Bigfoot being attacked by 2 large wolves, which it grabbed and threw aside, October 1983. Near Rosa, man driving on 59 highway saw a 7-foot Bigfoot standing in road, 9th April 1986. Between Sandy Bay and Winnipeg, man chased Bigfoot-type creature which left footprints like a human hand 16 inches across, August 1982. Near Woodridge, ghost light seen in forest, 1950 to 1970. In New Brunswick, lake monster reports at Grand Lake, Lac Lamond, Lake Makapi, St. Croix River, Skiff Lake, and at Lake Utopia, Old Ned. At Nelson Miramichi, security guard at Mill saw baby kangaroo, which bounded into bush. Others saw it June 1979. St. Croix River, fishermen on river at Bayside saw sets of fins 20 feet and 50 feet apart. Later saw head with huge green eyes, 10th August 1903. Near St. John, 2 men by lake at night saw UFO with red, orange, green, and blue lights, which came down onto water, making a sizzling noise before submerging completely. Next day, water was muddy and hot near place where UFO sank, summer 1967. And now some strange occurrences from Newfoundland. Conception Bay, St. John's. Phantom ship seen, November 1910. In Conception Bay, as well as Heart's Delight Harbor, White Bay, and Trinity Bay, sightings of giant squids, 1901 to 1935. Lakes monster reports at Crescent Lake, Dildo Pond, yes, it says that, and it's spelled that way, Gander Lake, Long Pond, and Swanger's Cove. At Flat Rock, St. John's, house plagued for 2 weeks by fire spook. Doll, dictionary, box of religious tracts, and sacks of sugar burst into flame spontaneously, November 1954. At Goose Bay, Labrador, fiery spherical UFO seen to make right-angle turn by plane crew, also seen from ground, early 1952. Off north coast of Labrador, cylindrical UFO with lighted portholes hit the sea and sank, 23rd September 1960. Port-à-Port, sea monster 200 feet long, 18 feet diameter, and neck 60 feet out of water was said to be destroying fishing gear, August 1936. At Traverse Bay near Goose Bay, Labrador, isolated house often visited by hairy Bigfoot-type creature around 7 feet tall when erect, though it sometimes dropped to all fours. It wielded a stick against the dogs and stayed around the area for 2 winters, around 1913. March 18th, 1950, 1830 hours. Lago Argentino, in Argentina, a rancher, Wilfredo H. Arevalo, saw 2 objects, one of which landed. He walked within 150 meters of the aluminum-looking craft, which gave off a greenish-blue vapor and an intense smell of burning benzene. A large flat section on top was revolving above a glass cabin in which could be seen 4 tall men dressed in something like cellophane, working at various instruments. They saw him and shone a light in his direction, while a blue light illuminated the craft. The vapor increased and flames, alternately reddish and greenish, shot out of the base while the object rose with a faint hum. Both craft flew away towards Chile, leaving bluish trails. April 1950, Juneau, Alaska. Mikhail Conrad made a movie of 8 discs he saw landing and taking off 60 kilometers north of Juneau. April 8, 1950, 0200 hours. Kokomo, Indiana. A metal worker was awakened by his dog and observed an object 60 meters away at low altitude. It was a gray metal disc, 5 meters in diameter, shaped like a top with a kind of turret. It was oscillating, spinning slowly, and had 3 portholes shining with a blue-white light. It hovered for about 2 minutes, left toward the north very fast. April 8, 1950, in the afternoon, at River Road, near Amarillo, Texas, David 12 and Charles 9, Lightfoot, saw a disc land behind a hill and touched it. It was the size of a car tire, about 30 centimeters high, with a rounded top that rotated in a pivot between the base and the top. It took off very fast. The faces and arms of the boys later became red. April 20th, 1950, nighttime, in Lufkin, Texas. Jack Robertson was driving about 13 kilometers west of town when he saw a round object about 3 meters in diameter hovering about 7 meters above him with a dull red glow. It took off with a swooshing roar. A spark flew from a slot under it. Minutes later, the witness felt a burning sensation on his face. April 24th, 1950, 2200 hours. Abbiate Guazzone, Italy. Bruno Facchini heard and saw sparks coming from a dark, hovering object near which a man dressed in tight-fitting clothes and wearing a helmet seemed to be making repairs. 3 other men were seen near the craft. When the work was finished, a trap through which light had been shining was closed and the thing took off. The witness had the time to note many details of the machine and its occupants. May 7th, 1950, 1845 hours at Eli or Eli, Nevada. A couple and their grandson were returning from a picnic when, about 14 kilometers south of town, they saw a silvery white object at treetop level. It hovered for about 10 minutes, then oscillated, quote, as if attempting to rise, and suddenly flew out of sight at high speed. July 2nd, 1950, at Steep Rock Lake, Canada, in a story strangely similar to that of Mr. Keel in August 1914, a man and his wife saw a double saucer with portholes and a rotating antenna come to rest on the surface of the lake. 10 figures 1.20 meters tall, dressed in shiny clothing, emerged and walked on deck like robots, quote, changing direction without turning their bodies. Their faces cannot be seen. One of them wore a red cap, had darker arms and legs, and seemed to be their chief. They immersed a hose in the lake, then took off. Fishermen later reported a green moss forming on the lake. From the Rainham Echo, Tuesday, 18th August 1970. Title, A Flying Saucer Shock for Young Couple. A flying saucer was seen at Rainham last week. In fact, it almost landed. Mr. Jones told police they stopped about 10:50 p.m. on Wednesday after they heard, quote, loud electrical noises. He says the object, about 20 feet, or 6.10 meters long, and 10 feet, or 3.05 meters wide, hovered only a little way above the ground for a few seconds before flying away towards Hornchurch. It was glowing red, with 4 white lights along its underside. A spokesman for the Ministry of Defense said that he had absolutely no idea what this could have been. Quote, this one is a mystery to us. From Havering and Romford Express, 1st September 1971, titled Residents See Thing in Sky. Every night, families in Old Church Road, Romford, take part in a Spot the Blob contest, and they're treating it seriously. The families are baffled by a mysterious pink object which has been spotted several times hovering over Dagenham. Quote, it was as big as my house, through the binoculars, and moving about in a wriggling movement very fast, end quote, said Mrs. Saunders. Quote, it was reddish and twisting about ever so fast with a red light coming out of the side of it, she said. From the Advisor, 14th September 1975, title, Pam's UFOs Put Her in a Spin. The chances of spotting a UFO are many thousands to 1, but the odds have been incredibly reduced for Dagenham housewife Pamela Cliff, who now claims she has made 4 sightings. Quote, it was a roundish-shaped object with lights around its edge. It was very clear, but I still had to get my husband Dave. He was a bit skeptical at first, but had to admit he saw it too. It was there for about 2 hours until it slowly disappeared, end quote. It was also seen by other residents on the same nights in Dagenham and Ilford. In September 1962, in Barcelos, Brazil, police officials investigating extensive flying saucer reports learned that 17 chickens, 6 pigs, and 2 cows had all vanished during the UFO wave. A man also disappeared during the flap. His name was Telemaco Xavier, and he vanished near the village of Villa Conseco later on the night of September 1st, 1962. 3 plantation workers testified that they had seen a lone man walking down a deserted road that night when an illuminated circular object spraying sparks swept down from the sky. 3 men leaped out, grabbed the lone stroller, and dragged him off. Whether or not Senor Xavier was that man remains unproven, but he was never seen again. Shortly after sundown on the evening of November 14th, 1966, Newell Partridge of Salem, West Virginia, was watching television when suddenly the set, quote, began to make noises like a generator. As he decided to take a look outside, his thoroughbred German Shepherd Bandit, quote, started carrying on something terrible. He flashed a light into a neighboring field and saw what he described as 2 bright red glowing objects. Bandit growled and ran into the field, the lights vanished, and the dog was never seen again. On the evening of December 9th, 1966, in Gallipolis, Ohio, Mrs. Marilyn Taylor had been driving when she saw a circular reddish-orange light appear in front of her car at telephone pole height. It bobbed up and down, she said, and flashed beams of light towards the road. Quote, it was the size of a helicopter, but it was no helicopter, she declared. She said she followed it for about a mile until she reached a well-lighted area near a transformer installation. Then the object shot into the air and disappeared. Her 4 children were with her in the car, and her 6-year-old boy expressed great fear of the object. In 1972, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, James Peace, director of the Bauer Contemporary Ballet Company, and his wife, Susie Bauer, had a very strange experience. He relates, my brother Mitchell moved into the Milwaukee apartment with me to share expenses. Susie and I were quite miserable. One night about a week after she had left Milwaukee, she went into her bedroom with a bottle of wine, put a record on the stereo, and sat down on the floor leaning against her bed. She was unhappy and felt trapped by the decision she had made, and in an attempt to tune out her thoughts, she immersed herself in the music. Meanwhile, Mitchell and I had finished our gourmet dinner in front of the television. Mitch was sitting on the couch. I was in an easy chair with my back to the archway leading to the dining room. Suddenly I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye of what I thought to be Susie standing at the edge of the archway over my left shoulder, as if she was entering the room. It took only a few microseconds to recall that Susie was in New York and couldn't be entering the living room. My double take at this apparition was violent enough to cause Mitch to turn his head from the TV and ask what was going on. I replied something like, I could have sworn I just saw Susie starting to come into the room. Shrugged it off, and we continued to watch the tube. A minute or two later, the phone rang. It was Susie calling from New York, and she seemed quite upset. Her exact words were, I was just there. And I responded, I know. She went on to tell me how we had arranged the furniture with perfect accuracy, where we were sitting, where the beer cans were, what dinnerware we had used, and where the dirty dishes were located, and that Mitch had used an end table as a TV table. She described Mitch as sitting back into the sofa with his feet up on the end table, all true, and that I had just reached for my beer when she became frightened because she thought I had seen her. I had to think about that for a moment and then realized that it was true. Susie described the experience as going into a trance and feeling herself lifted out of herself, hovering above her body as if from the ceiling. Looking down on herself, she thought how ridiculous it was to feel so miserable about a circumstance of her own making, that if she didn't want to be there, she should do something about it. Suddenly, she found herself walking past the bedroom of our apartment in Milwaukee, across the entrance room, and as she entered the dining room, turned and approached the archway to the living room. She became conscious of the fact that she couldn't be there. When she thought I had noticed her, she became frightened at what would happen and opened her eyes sitting on the floor of a bedroom in New York. Peace adds that after the experience, Susie felt completely uncomfortable, as if she was in a body she didn't know, and that it took about a day to get over this feeling of wrongness. On August 19, 1970, at Bukit Mertajam, Penang, Malaysia, 6 schoolboys, aged 8 to 11, Mohammed Zulkifli, Abdul Rahim, David Tan, Sulaiman K. Wigneswaran, and Muhammad Ali, at the Stoll English Primary School, claimed that a soup plate-sized flying saucer landed near them while they were busy playing cops and robbers near the school. When the tiny object landed, 5, quote, horrible-looking, 3-inch-high spacemen put out a plank and emerged from the saucer. 4 of the spacemen wore blue uniforms, 1 wore yellow. The one in yellow looked to the boys like the leader, and sported horns, stars on his shirt, and high boots. The 5 beings were armed with miniature space guns. When the spacemen began installing what looked to be an aerial on a tree, Wigneswaran tried to capture the leader. At that point, the leader fired his tiny space gun. The other boys then got scared and ran away. Wigneswaran was later found lying in the bushes by a school official. A small red dot appeared on the boy's right leg where he had been quote-unquote shot. Some of the other boys reported subsequent encounters with the tiny spaceman the following day, though the headmaster, who felt the whole thing was a figment of their imagination, questioned the boys carefully. They all insisted on the truth of their story. Although this report is replete with classic science fiction elements, it is by no means the only report in the literature of beings of such extremely small stature. In April 1965, James Flynn was on a hunting trip in the Florida Everglades, and on seeing a strange glowing cone-shaped object descend onto the swamp, he drove near to it and then walked to within a few yards. He raised his arm and waved. Immediately, a beam of light shot out from the UFO and struck him squarely on the forehead. When he recovered consciousness 24 hours later, he was partly blind due to internal hemorrhaging. Later, investigators examined the scorched grass circle and burnt treetops where the UFO had hovered. In October 1973, truck driver Eddie Webb poked his head out of his cab window and looked back at the rainbow array of lights which were rapidly gaining on him as he drove to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, USA. Immediately as he did so, a yellow-red beam of light struck him in the face and temporarily blinded him. The frame of his spectacles was warped and melted, and he was in hospital for 7 days recovering his sight. He successfully claimed insurance compensation for his injury. In August of 1967, in Brazil, Inácio de Souza, a farm manager, saw a UFO in one of his fields. 3 entities wearing tight-fitting yellow jersey suits were playing about like children. When they saw de Souza, they ran towards him, and he started to shoot at them with a rifle. As he did so, a beam of green light streaked from the UFO and hit him in the chest, knocking him to the ground. The entities retreated to the UFO, which quickly took off. In the ensuing days, de Souza experienced nausea and tingling of the body as well as general numbness. He lost weight quickly, and blood tests showed that he had severe leukemia. Within 2 months, he was dead from radiation poisoning. In November 1978, 4 men hunting at night in Seville, Spain, observed a landed UFO with an entity moving about near it. Some of the witnesses saw only the lower half of the entity, while the others could see it only from the waist up. In El Paso, Texas, a man on Sunday said there were humanoid-like creatures wearing wetsuits, hopping from rooftop to rooftop in his western Texas neighborhood. Michael N., an El Paso resident who claimed to speak on behalf of his neighbors, says the alleged creatures are active at night. Quote, "Now they appear to run and jump from rooftop to rooftop," says Michael. The Texan describes the creatures as tall, skinny humanoids that appear to be wearing wetsuits. Quote, "They are not using a face mask." The first time he spotted one of the purported beings, he says, was in 1988. Quote, "I was home alone sick when I saw one through the slide door window looking into my backyard. I panicked and it noticed me watching it. It also panicked and ran off in the neighbor's yard. I lost track of it after that. But the man believes that things were different back then. Quote, "As the neighborhood became arid and more sparse over the years, they needed to find other methods for getting around. They now use the rooftops late at night when most people are asleep," he explains. He and his neighbors are uneasy about these sightings and are asking for help to determine what is happening in their El Paso neighborhood. "We just would like an investigation to be done. We are curious for some answers," he said. A woman in Portugal claimed she and her sister saw 2 Neanderthals. The 83-year-old Serra da Estrela resident told Cryptozoology News she and her sister were caring for a herd of cows when they spotted the 2, quote, "primitive men. I was 5 years old and my sister was 8. We are in a remote area in the Serra da Estrela when we saw 2 naked men speaking in a totally strange language," she said about the 1939 alleged encounter. "Then we saw them entering a cave." The following day, she explains, they decided to check out the cave with their sheepdog. Quote, "But when we reached the cave, our dog didn't want to go in. He kept growling and my sister wanted to go back. We could smell smoke that appeared to come from inside the cave." Later that day, she reports that when they told their father about the incident, he became angry. Quote, "He told us he already knew about the existence of these people, who said that they were the original peoples who survived in a few numbers and were still living in a primitive state. I remember him saying that there were only about half a dozen individuals left. The, quote, wild people, as the woman referred to, were described as being naked and had a yellow skin color." In Frome, England, a 54-year-old man says his Somerset County home was broken in by a group of beings that looked like the typical Greys. Nick, a carpenter in Frome, told Cryptozoology News on Friday that he and his partner were in bed when he first noticed the presence of the reported entities. Quote, "I was trying to sleep," he said about the alleged 1995 incident, "woke up unable to move and presumed it was sleep paralysis, of which I am aware, and then became aware of figures at the bottom of my bed. I tried to rouse my partner but couldn't make a sound. Next thing, I was asleep again," he added. The following morning, Nick's 2 sons, 8 and 5, reportedly asked their father about the entities. "They asked me if the clowns would be coming back," he recalls. "When I questioned them about what they meant, they both independently said that clowns had come through their window and that I had chased them off with my baseball bat." Nick says that his son's questioning was unusual because they didn't know that he kept his baseball bat under his bed at night. The eyewitness described the creatures as the typical grays, just like the one pictured on the cover of Whitley Strieber's 1987 book Communion and rendered by artist Ted Seth Jacobs. The story was later made popular by a movie of the same name starring Christopher Walken. It says Christopher Walker here. Oh, come on, guys. Christopher freaking Walken, man. Alright, but this wasn't the only oddity Nick reportedly saw that day. A few hours later, he says he spotted a few flying objects he describes as jellyfish floating above an apartment building.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
Living with a zombie. When I was in college, I had a good friend who we would call Baron. Actually, the name we would really call him was a different royal title, but for the sake of anonymity, I'll just refer to him as Baron. He was a good friend for 2 years before I said goodbye to him at the beginning of the summer of 1999. The next time I saw him, he was eating in the school cafe with his brother and a friend. I asked him something like, "So you guys drive here from Montgomery?" And he just gave me a strange, angry look and said, "Yeah, how else do you think we got here?" This obnoxious response was very much not characteristic of my good friend, so I just kind of stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to say. His brother and friend just sat there, not looking at me, just staring at their plates in a very awkward manner. I decided that he must be angry at me for something I couldn't think of, so I said goodbye and left, bewildered and troubled over why he was so obviously upset with me. At the time, I had been living alone in a 2-person dorm room because my previous roommate had left early. One night, I was lying in bed with the lights off and I heard people coming into my room. Soon there was a whole family milling about the room, a mother, a father, a gaggle of young children, and, astonishingly enough, my good old friend Baron. It turned out that he was moving into my dorm room to be my new roommate. When I said hello to him and commented on how interesting it was that he just happened to be moving into my room, he basically ignored me. I began to get rather confused at this point. His mom tried to help him set up his bedding, and he kept insisting, "No, I can do it," until his mom, who was already creeping me out at this point, yelled loudly at him, "You get behind me, Satan!" Baron then instantly snapped into a subservient state. His mother, a heavy-set middle-aged woman of African descent, then sat on the edge of his bed and began talking to me. All the while, the father, very tall and disturbingly stoic man, just stood in the corner, staring, with the children milling about his feet like ducklings. The mother asked me in a very intense and theatrical voice, "Are you part of the family?" I stammered, You mean the family of God?" And she shouted back at me, "No! The family!" I was beginning to become terrified at this point. She then gestured at a flag I had up for the German Electro-Industrial Act Wumpscut, and said something like, "All these things you have around you, these things of evil. You must not surround yourself with these things!" Baron then utterly shifted his posture and mannerisms and scowled at her, arguing, "But Mom, it's just a flag!" She then snapped at him again, and he instantly popped back into his old subservient mode of behavior, and even began speaking in unison with her. The both of them staring at me, the creepy tall man in the corner just staring at me, the wandering toddlers as well. It truly was one of the most frighteningly creepy experiences of my life. The family eventually departed, leaving Baron behind in his new room with me, and he just stood there, staring at the wall, exclaiming, "Damn! Damn!" like he was seeing something indescribable or something. I then asked him, my voice shaky with shock, "So, Baron, now that your mom's gone, can you tell me what's going on here?" What he said next was like something straight out of a horror movie. I could hardly believe my ears. He said, without looking at me as he was still staring at the wall, "Oh, don't worry. Baron is still in here." I was dumbstruck. I had no idea what to do or say. He then added, "You have to understand, my mother, she has a kind of an orb around her." This was just too much. I quickly walked out and drove to a friend's house, where I slept on his couch, still shaken by the inexplicable encounter. The next morning, I went straight to the director of student housing and told him what happened. That this person living with me was not my friend Baron, but was now an extremely mentally unwell individual. I was completely taken by surprise when he brushed me off and did absolutely nothing about it. I wound up living and sleeping in the same small dorm room with a clearly insane person, who unfortunately used to be one of my best friends, for about 3 months. When I would tell people around campus about it, the ones who didn't know him before would say things like, "Oh, Baron, what a fine young man he is. He is so on fire for Jesus. I would just shake my head in disgust and helplessness. That was not Baron at all. He was never a Christian, and was certainly not ever on fire for Christ, so to speak. This was a diametrically different personality in his body. My friends, who also knew him before his change, were as baffled and unsettled as I was. The director of student housing refused, for some strange reason, to move either he or I to a different room. Baron would do this strange thing a lot where, when I was trying to leave our room to go to class, he would keep calling me back in the room. But when I'd asked him, exasperated, What do you want? He would just stare with a vexed look in his eyes. I would eventually just have to leave with him desperately calling out after me. One time, I finally got him to give me a reason not to go outside. He told me that there were people out in the woods whom I had to watch out for. He would spend hours every day just sitting at his desk, just staring with all the lights off. Sometimes he would lie in bed with his face to the wall for hours. One time, I was in the bathroom and he kept knocking on the door. I would ask him what he wanted, but he wouldn't answer. So I opened the door and asked him, "What is it?" and found him standing right in front of me but facing away. He wouldn't answer me, so I tapped him on the shoulder. He violently spun around and yelled at me, "Don't you penetrate my orb!" So I answered defensively, "Baron, you are knocking on the door. I just want to know why." And he said, "Oh, someone called you on your phone." One time I made some offhand comment about something which had nothing to do with him. I believe it was about something in my mini fridge. And he started berating me furiously, saying things like, "What? Do you have a problem? It's just a carving!" I answered, "What the hell? What are you talking about, a carving?" I then saw that he was holding a small wooden carving which looked African in origin. He would hold it out in front of himself and recite some unintelligible chant. He also would stare at a locket his terrifying mother had given him. On one side of it there was a picture of her when she was a child, small child, creepy. And on the other side was a Bible verse. I don't think I ever saw which verse it was, or I forgot. My friends and I assumed that he had taken a large amount of LSD that summer, and it had triggered a latent schizophrenia, as can happen to people who are already potential schizophrenics. He was displaying many characteristics of paranoid schizophrenia, but we didn't know for certain that had happened. It was just our best guess. Eventually, the housing director found out that Baron had stopped attending his classes quite a while ago, and he called his family to come pick him up. Or the housing director didn't. The housing director called his family to pick him up. That was the last time I ever saw my old friend. Years later, when I got into researching religion and the occult, I found out that Baron's mother was most certainly a practitioner of hoodoo, which is an African diaspora religion. It is similar to voodoo, which is a combination of elements of Catholicism and traditional African practices, only hoodoo is fused with Protestant Christianity rather than Catholicism. I also found out that the way in which Baron behaved was very similar to victims of real-life zombification, which is a practice of altering someone's personality to make them more malleable, or even slaves to your will. It does not involve resurrecting someone's dead corpse, of course, but does involve a regimen of a cocktail of nasty psychoactive drugs, datura, for instance, being a common one, and also spiritual rituals, which effectively place the personality of a spirit into the body of a human being, in effect pushing the original human personality aside. I'm reminded of when Baron said, "Don't worry, Baron is still in here." I know that most people who weren't there and didn't know him before would understandably write this off as mere paranoid schizophrenia, as I did for years. But I am convinced now that it was much more than that. Something much more insidious and awful. Alright, next episode, I'll continue with this grab bag of childhood stories, including Mystery Gifts, Queen Mary, Pink Light, and The Trials of Jim.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed. She went into an alternate dimension.
This article is called 3-Year-Old Remembers Past Life, Identifies Murderer and Location of Body. It was written by Tara MacIsaac and posted on the Epoch Times on May 17th, 2014. Here's an interesting one for the day. Earlier this year, a 3-year-old boy in the Golan Heights region near the border of Syria and Israel said he was murdered with an axe in his previous life. Okay, so what? Children claim to have memories of silly things all the time and are known for playing with their imaginary friends, right? But here's where it gets weird. He then proceeded to show village elders where the murderer buried his body, and sure enough they found a man's skeleton there. He also showed the elders where the murder weapon would be found, and upon digging, they did indeed find an axe there. In his book, Children Who Have Lived Before Reincarnation Today, German therapist Trutz Hardot tells this boy's story, along with other stories of children who seem to remember their past lives with verified accuracy. The boy's story was witnessed by Dr. Eli Lash, who is best known for developing the medical system in Gaza as part of an Israeli government operation in the 1960s. Dr. Lash, who died in 2009, had recounted these astounding events to Hardo. The boy was of the Druze ethnic group, and in his culture the existence of reincarnation is accepted as fact. But even in a culture where reincarnation was accepted, his story nonetheless had the power to surprise his community. This is because his story contained pieces of information which he had no possible way of knowing, which were later verified to be true. This boy was born with a long, red birthmark on his head. This is precisely what you would expect to find on someone if they had suffered a fatal wound there in their previous life. The Druze do believe that birthmarks are related to past life traumas, and so does the boy, apparently. When he was old enough to talk, he told his family he had been killed by a blow to the head with an axe. It is customary for elders to take a child at the age of 3 to the home of his previous life if he remembers it. Quite a cultural difference from the Western world. After arriving to the village, the boy was able to remember all the details of the village and the name of the person he was in a previous life. A village local said the man the boy claimed to be the reincarnation of had gone missing 4 years earlier. His friends and family thought he may have strayed into hostile territory nearby, as sometimes happens. Here's where it gets interesting. The boy also remembered the full name of his killer and confronted the man who had killed him in his past life. The murderer's face turned white, although he did not yet admit to the crime. The boy then said he could take the elders to where the body was buried. In that very spot, they found a man's skeleton with a wound to the head that corresponded to the boy's birthmark. Nearby, they also found the axe that was used as the murder weapon. The murderer then proceeded to admit to the crime after being faced with this evidence. Dr. Lash, the only non-Druze, was present through this whole process and testifies to this story.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called Albatwitch is a mini Bigfoot with an arm for apple throwing. It was posted to mysteriousuniverse.org on October 2nd, 2014 by Paul Seaburn. What would you call a 4-foot-tall, ape-like creature covered in reddish-brown hair that likes to steal, eat, and throw apples? If you live in Columbia, Pennsylvania, you might call it a good reason to hold an Albatwitch festival celebrating a local mystery. Columbia is in Pennsylvania's Amish country, but the legend of the Albatwitch may date back 500 years to the Susquehannock Indians who lived along the Susquehanna River and were known to draw ape-like creatures on their war shields. This area is home to Chickies Rock, a popular picnic spot in the 1800s where the creature's name and reputation may have originated, according to Rick Fisher, curator of the National Museum of Mysteries and Research Center in Columbia. Quote, "These creatures, the Albatwitch, would come out of the trees and steal apples from the people who were picnicking there. They would eat the apples and throw the cores back at the people. The name Albatwitch is believed to be a variation on apple snitch from its fruity kleptomaniac behavior. While similar in spelling, it has nothing to do with the Albadritcht, which is a different myth among the local German population, having to do with a creature with a goat's horns, duck's bill, rabbit's ears, and squirrel's tail, whose hunts are a popular April Fool's prank. Sightings of the Albatwitch tapered off in the late 1800s, but picked up steam again starting in the 1950s with new reports of a man-like creature around Chickies Rock. One witness is Rick Fisher himself, who claims he saw an Albatwitch on Route 23 while driving toward Marietta, Pennsylvania. Another is Chris Vera, who says a boyhood friend was pinned to a tree by one. Vera is president of the Columbia Historic Preservation Society, and he and Fisher are the creators of the Albatwitch Festival, which was held on September 27th. Pennsylvania has a long history of Bigfoot sightings, so the Albatwitch could possibly be a similar species, a Sasquatch child, or a smaller relative.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called George Bush Sr. on UFOs. Americans Can't Handle the Truth. It was posted to yournewswire.com on October 5th, 2015 by Sean Adl-Tabatabai. During a recent Jeb Bush fundraiser in Orlando, his father George Bush Sr. left the large crowd uneasy after responding to a question about UFOs. An activist/journalist asked when the U.S. government would tell the truth about UFOs, but the answer George Bush Sr. gave took the crowd and reporters completely by surprise. He replied, "Americans can't handle the truth," before the questioning was briefly halted by the event organizers. WorldNewsDailyReport.com reports, in hope of helping his son's Jeb Bush's struggling presidential campaign, George Bush Sr. and former President George W. Bush have been campaigning behind the presidential candidate in hopes of bringing the Bush family's name once again behind the Oval Office, but some experts believe this kind of incident could cost him at the race. During the fundraiser, a man in the crowd raises a strange question, which led to an even more surprising response by the former president's CIA director. The man asked George Bush Sr. when the U.S. government would tell Americans the truth about UFOs, to which he responded, "Americans can't handle the truth," before the questioning was stopped. Oddly enough, it is not the first time George Bush Sr. has had a controversial opinion on the UFO subject, as a similar incident occurred on March 7, 1988, during a trip to a George Bush for President rally in Rogers, Arkansas. The to-be president was then asked in the advent that he became president if he would tell Americans the truth about the existence of UFOs, to which Bush replied, "I am very careful in public life about dealing with classified information," he told the reporter. James Adder, journalist for the Arkansas Globe at the time, also asked about Bush's knowledge about the UFO phenomena, on behalf of which Bush answered, "I know some, I know a fair amount," before ending the interview.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called Highest Ranking NSA Whistleblower of All Time Addresses the UFO Question. See what he has to say. And it was posted to collectiveevolution.com on September 3rd, 2014 by Arjun Walia. Just as Edward Snowden made huge headlines and still is all over the world, William Binney did the same in 2001 when he resigned from the National Security Agency after 9/11 and blew the lid on an NSA mass surveillance program. He worked for the agency for more than 30 years and was the leading codebreaker against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He had quite the run, starting in 2002 when he let the public know of a system, Trailblazer, intended to analyze data carried on communication networks, like the internet. He exposed the agency's eavesdropping, and has faced harassment from the FBI, NSA, and more. He has been in and out of court ever since he decided to resign and blow the whistle. Binney was recently interviewed on 9/11 Free Fall Radio, where he said, quote, "We selectively ignore basic facts. What I mean by a basic fact is something that's just there that needs to be addressed even if they can't explain it. They should have said, 'We can't explain this, but there it is, it's there.' So at least they recognize that this basic fact existed. My problem is, just like the UFO thing, unless they start addressing these kinds of things, people's observations or basic measurements or factual evidence that simply exists, unless they start addressing them, there's always going to be questions, especially now with the government. How much trust do you have with this government? They've been spying, putting whistleblowers in jail, torturing, and giving immunity to people who commit these kinds of crimes. How much trust can you put in a government like that when you selectively ignore these kinds of things?" End quote. It's great to hear someone who had such a long career with the NSA mention UFOs, although many high-ranking defense personnel have made remarkable statements as well, and the importance of governments addressing this phenomenon that is flooded with people's observations of factual evidence. Clearly, Binney is aware of the phenomenon and the seriousness of the issue.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called "Man Claims He Has Not Eaten or Drunk Any Liquids for 70 Years. Science Examines Him." It was posted to collectiveevolution.com on July 4th, 2013 by Joe Martino. Is it possible for us to survive without food or water? Doctors are now trying to determine that thanks to the baffling claims of an Indian man who says he has not consumed either for the last 70 years. Even more shocking, he is in perfect health. Raised in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, Prahlad Jani says he has not had any food or liquids since he was 8 years old. He also claims to have been blessed at that time by a goddess, which is what allows him to survive without sustenance except for that which he derives from meditation. Sudhir Shah and a team of 35 researchers from the Indian Defense Institute of Physiology and Allied Sciences and other organizations observed and tested Johnny over the course of 15 days in the private Sterling Hospital. They studied him daily through clinical examinations, blood tests, and scans, and surveilled him 24 hours a day using CCTV cameras, so as to assure he did not consume anything. According to researchers, the only time Johnny was taken out of his sealed room was for tests and exposure to sun, and they continued to video record him during these times to ensure the authenticity of their results. Johnny was only exposed to liquids when he bathed or gargled water, and his toilet was sealed to test his claims that he did not urinate or defecate. After 15 days of intensive observation, during which time Johnny did not eat, drink, or go to the toilet, all medical test results came back as normal, and doctors described his health as being better than someone half his age. Interestingly, doctors reported that although the amount of liquid in Johnny's bladder fluctuated and that Johnny appeared, quote, unable to generate urine in his bladder, he did not pass any urine. His reported levels of leptin and ghrelin, two appetite-related hormones, suggested that Johnny may be demonstrating an extreme form of adaptation to starvation and water restriction. Even after the 15-day examination, the IPAS is still interested in running tests on Johnny to determine how metabolic waste material is eliminated from his body, where he gets his energy for sustenance, and how he stays hydrated. The director of DIPAS believes that the results of Johnny's observations could, quote, tremendously benefit mankind. Professor Anil Gupta of the SRISTI, involved in monitoring the tests, described the team as being intrigued by Johnny's kriyas, apparently allowing him to control his body's physiological functions. Most people can live without food for several weeks, with the body drawing on its fat and protein stores, but the average human can survive for only 3 to 4 days without water. How is Johnny able to survive without either? Some believe that his access to bathing allows him to store liquid in the body, while others believe he had food or water after their short study. But Johnny is not the first person to be tested with such claims. HRM, another Indian man, was tested intensively for 411 days after he claimed that he did not eat any food. While HRM did consume boiled water, researchers confirmed that he did not eat during the observation period and yet maintained perfect health. This is exciting to me because, regardless of the current science we accept when it comes to the physiology of the body, it is becoming clear that we may not have it all correct, and that it is possible to change the consciousness of our body to operate differently. Having tried sun gazing for several long periods myself, I can attest to the fact that you certainly get energy and what feels like nutrient energy from the sun alone. While sun gazing, I found I could perform a physical activity with much more energy than I could while eating healthy meals. I didn't practice sun gazing long enough to say whether I could have survived on the sun alone, but my results were certainly encouraging.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called The Evidence for Non-Local Consciousness. Researchers prove consciousness can exist outside of the body and after death. It's posted to consciouslifestylemag.com by Stanislav Grof, MD, PhD. Some observations from the study of holotropic states, non-ordinary or altered states of consciousness, are so radical that they not only challenge the theory and practice of psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy, but also undermine some of the most fundamental metaphysical assumptions of Western science. None of these conceptual challenges are more drastic and far-reaching than the new insights regarding the nature of non-local consciousness and its relationship to matter. According to Western neuroscience, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter, a byproduct of the complex neurophysiological processes in the brain, and thus an intrinsic and inseparable part of the body. Modern consciousness research conducted in the last 5 decades has made this hypothesis highly questionable. Very few people, including most scientists, realize that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is actually produced in the brain and by the brain. There is no doubt that there exists vast clinical and experimental evidence showing significant interconnections and correlations between the anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry of the brain on one hand, and states of consciousness on the other. However, it represents a major logical jump to infer from the available data that these correlations represent a proof that the brain is actually the source of consciousness. And, in fact, the data largely points to the fact that consciousness is non-local. Such a deduction would be tantamount to the conclusion that the TV program is generated in the TV set because there is a close correlation between functioning or malfunctioning of its components and the quality of the sound and picture. It should be obvious from this example that the close connection between cerebral activity and consciousness does not exclude the possibility that the brain mediates consciousness but does not actually generate it. The research of holotropic states has amassed ample evidence for this alternative, that consciousness is non-local to the body. There exist no scientific theories explaining how consciousness is generated by material processes, nor does anybody have even a remote idea how something like that could possibly happen. The gap between consciousness and matter is so formidable that it is impossible to imagine how it could be bridged. In spite of the lack of convincing evidence that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain or matter, this basic metaphysical assumption remains one of the leading myths of Western materialistic science. While there exists no scientific proof for the fact that the brain generates consciousness, there are numerous observations indicating that consciousness can, under certain circumstances, function independently of the brain and of the world of matter. This philosophy is referred to as non-local consciousness. In holotropic states, non-ordinary or altered states of consciousness, our consciousness can reach far beyond the boundaries of the body, ego, and obtain accurate information about various aspects of the material world that we have not obtained in this lifetime through the mediation of our sensory organs, which would not be possible unless consciousness is non-local in nature. We have already mentioned reliving of birth, of prenatal memories, and of conception. In transpersonal experiences, our non-local consciousness can identify with other people, with members of various species of the animal kingdom from primates to unicellular organisms, with plant life, and even with inorganic materials and processes. We can also transcend linear time and experience vivid ancestral, racial, karmic, and phylogenetic sequences, and episodes from the collective unconscious. Transpersonal experiences can provide not only accurate new information about various aspects of the material world, including those that we are unfamiliar with, but also about various figures and realms of the archetypal domain of the collective unconscious. We can witness or even participate in mythological sequences from any culture of the world in any historical period accurately portrayed in every detail. It is absurd to attribute this rich array of experiences accurately portraying various present and past aspects of the material world and figures, realms, and themes from world mythology to some yet unknown pathology afflicting the brain, whereas we believe that is in fact a byproduct of the abilities we have as a result of the inherent properties of non-local consciousness. The most convincing evidence that consciousness is not produced by the brain and can function independently of it comes from the young scientific discipline of thanatology, the study of death and dying. It is now an established fact, confirmed by many independent observations, that disembodied non-local consciousness of people in near-death situations is able to accurately observe the environment in various near or remote locations and events. Individuals who are clinically dead, in a state of cardiac death and even brain death, are able to observe their bodies and the rescue procedures from above and travel freely to other parts of the same building or various remote places. Independent research has repeatedly confirmed the accuracy of the observations made by disembodied non-local consciousness. It refers to Ring and Valerino, 1998, and Sabam, 1982 and 1998. Such non-local consciousness experiences are strikingly reminiscent of the descriptions of the Bardo body found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Bardo Thodol. This famous spiritual text states that, after having fainted from fear in the Chanyad Bardo, the dying person awakens in the Sidpa Bardo in a new form, the Bardo body. This body differs from the gross body of everyday life. It is not composed of matter and has many remarkable qualities such as the power of unimpeded motion, the ability to penetrate through solid objects, and the capacity to perceive the world without the mediation of the senses. Those who exist in the form of the Bardo body can travel instantaneously to any place on Earth and even to the sacred cosmic mountain, Mount Meru. Only two places are not accessible in this form, the maternal womb and Bodh Gaya. Clear references to leaving the Bardo state at the time of conception or enlightenment, referencing Evans once, 1957. An extensive study conducted by Ken Ring and his colleagues has added a fascinating dimension to these observations. People who are congenitally blind for organic reasons and have never been able to see anything in their entire lives can perceive the environment when their non-local consciousness detaches from their bodies during various life-threatening situations. The veracity of many of these visions has been confirmed by consensual validation. Ring refers to such visions as veridical OBEs, out-of-body experiences. Ring and Valerino, Ring and Cooper. Various aspects of the environment accurately perceived by disembodied non-local consciousness of blind subjects ranged from details of electrical fixtures on the ceiling of the operating room to the surroundings of the hospital observed from a bird's-eye view. Modern thanatological research has thus confirmed an important aspect of classical descriptions of OBEs, which can be found in spiritual literature and philosophical texts. Veridical OBEs are not limited to near-death situations. We have seen them repeatedly in people undergoing psycho-spiritual crisis, spiritual emergencies, and in participants in holotropic breath workshops. Some of these individuals were able to observe the group from above and describe unusual behavior of some of its members in spite of the fact that they themselves breathed with their eyes closed. The non-local consciousness of others left the building and observed the environment from above or traveled to some remote locations and observed the events there. On occasion, these bird's-eye views appeared in the mandalas. These observations demonstrate without any reasonable doubt that consciousness is not a product of the brain and thus an epiphenomenon of matter. Consciousness is non-local. It is more likely at least an equal partner of matter or possibly superordinated to it. The matrices for many of the aforementioned experiences clearly are not contained in the brain, but are stored in some kind of immaterial field or in the field of non-local consciousness itself. The most promising developments in hard science offering models for transpersonal experience are David Bohm's idea of the implicate order, Bohm 1980, Rupert Sheldrake's concept of morphogenetic fields, Sheldrake 1981-1988, and Ervin Laszlo's hypothesis of the psi field or akashic field, Laszlo 1993 and 2004.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is created.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
The fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.